Good morning, my brothers, gathered as you are in Nairobi. I so much wish it was possible to be with you today. Sam knows that, and Cosmo knows that. Sammy, I think, knows that. I wish I knew more of who all of you are, but far, far away as you are from Washington, D.C. and from the United States. I have been to Kenya a couple of times, and I wish it was possible to enter into your life together today and be with you there. I'd love to know you and know why you're there and what you have come from in your lives this past week, and the sense of vocation which is yours and your life in Nairobi and in Kenya and beyond. So I'm grateful for the invitation, and I only wish it was possible to be present with you face to face for these hours of this day. So I'm going to be speaking to you twice today, one on the subject of the challenge of coherence, and then after that, a few hours later, on making peace with the proximate. But let's begin with the challenge of coherence. But as we do, let me simply pray. So God in heaven, be present with us today. We belong to you. We belong to your world. We long for your kingdom to come. We long for the things we do in the days of our lives to be part of the unfolding of your hopes for the world, your promises for the world, the work of your kingdom in the world. So hear us now as we pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I remember some years ago flying from Nairobi to Kisumu and sitting down on the plane, and a woman sat beside me, and she was a sophisticated looking person, a Kenyan person, I was assuming. But the first words out of her mouth were these: I am Kikuyu. I am Kikuyu. She went on to explain that she worked for Doctors Without Borders. She spoke in French, and so I heard it in that language. But I was struck by those first words to a stranger. She didn't know me. I didn't know her. I am Kikuyu. And it made me think, about a book I'd read the day before, flying from Washington, D.C. to Nairobi. I'd asked my good friend Cosmo who was living in Washington for several years, what should I read so I could understand more about Africa and about Kenya in particular? And he'd suggested a book that I read, and so I found it and brought it along on the plane. And of course, it's a long ride from here to there, and so I read through the hours of the day or the night. And one of the arguments that the author made about Africa at large as a continent was, he said that Africa is a tribal continent, not a nation state continent in the sense that might be more in the northern hemisphere, in the West, but a tribal continent. And if you were to understand, what Africa is and who Africans are, you'd have to understand, of course, that they will see themselves as, first of all, belonging to tribes. I make no pretense to being an expert about all that, but I did read those words and took them to heart, and was surprised the next day to be on the plane from Nairobi to Kisumu and having the first words out of the woman's mouth were, I am Kikuyu, explaining to me, of course, who she was and maybe why she was and the way she saw the world, because, of course, she belonged to that particular tribe. Well, I did fly to Kisumu, and I went off from there to several hours away to a little village, spent a week there and listening to people and getting to know people and understanding more about where I was and what I was doing there. But on the way back through Kisumu, I found a little bookstore, and I decided to purchase a book that I had known about, but now I wanted to understand more because where I'd been, not by a Kenyan, but by a Nigerian, Chinua Achebe, a book called famously Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart. And I'm sure most of you have read the book. Maybe you've read it several times in life. But of course, it's a story of, someone growing up in Nigeria in the earlier part of the 20th century. And, these were his backgrounds. This was the cultural context. And, push come to shove, when all is said and done, the argument of the book is, of course, that it's a messy world, actually, and that things simply don't make sense to most of us most of the time. Things fall apart is the way he put it. Things fall apart in the world. Well, some time around that period in my life, I hosted a man from Nairobi who came to Washington, D.C. for several days, and we had lunch together one day. He was at that point the Archbishop of the Anglican province of Kenya, Eliud Wabukula. Perhaps some of you know him. And we had a wonderful conversation that day and have become friends in the years since then. I've been actually back to Nairobi to talk to him when he was at the cathedral there. And we talked about many things, deep and wide and far reaching, and somebody who I think quite highly of. But as we were talking through in that first day here at a restaurant in Washington, D.C., he wanted, interestingly, a real American meal before we went back to Kenya. And we went to a place where he could get things he thought were distinctively American, and he enjoyed them. But it was not a fancy pants place. It was a place with paper napkins. And so I was explaining my work to him explaining his work to me. And I put on the paper napkin the words faith, vocation, and culture. Faith, vocation, and culture. And my work at the time was called the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture. And I simply said to him, you see that for everyone everywhere, wherever we are in the world, wherever we believe about the world, wherever we see ourselves in the world, we are people whose faith, whose deepest convictions about reality, about life in the world, shapes how we live in the world. And that has consequence for the world. That faith shapes vocation, which shapes culture, was the way what I said to him that day. And he looked back at me across the table and said, Steve, but that's the problem in Kenya, the problem really all over Africa. At that point, of course, he had Anglican responsibilities for more than Kenya, and with Anglicans really all over Africa and all over the world. And he said, as I watch the church in Africa, it's really our problem. We've disconnected faith from vocation to culture. We talk a lot about Jesus, he said, in our churches. And there were, at that point, 6 or 7 million people identifying with the Anglican Church in Kenya alone. He says, we talk a lot about Jesus, but it's a Jesus that is disconnected from vocation. It has nothing to say really about the vocations of our lives. And we have corrupt cultures in Africa. He says, would you please help us with this? And they seemed weighty words to me, in some ways very invitational words to me. And I have wished and wished and wished that I could do more with him and for him. And for Africa too, not because I have anything great to say or grand to do, but simply these are the great concerns of my life, and they were in its own way for him. But he said, when I see those words on the paper napkin, faith, vocation, culture, and you say that faith shapes vocation, shapes culture, he said, we've disconnected those in the church in Africa. I thought about, of course, Achibi's book, Things Fall Apart. And that is the human experience, of course, for most of us, wherever we are in the world, that how we see the world, what we believe about the world, how we live in the world, the consequence for the world, those are different compartments, different parts of life. We've disconnected them, as the Archbishop said to me that day. It's really a problem for people all over the world, though, isn't it, actually? And it's painful each time, economically, politically, socially. As much a problem in the United States as it is in the United Kingdom, a problem in Bratislava as it is in Beijing, a problem in Jakarta as it is in Jerusalem. It's a human problem, a problem for sons of Adam and daughters of Eve everywhere, everyone, everywhere. Well, you are African men, most of you at least. And I thought, as I was thinking through, being with you today, that maybe I would do my best to make this be a very African-rooted conversation we would have. I would love to be there face to face and know who you are and talk with you through the hours of the day. But the challenge of coherence between faith, between vocation and culture. How do we have a coherent life where all that we think, all that we are, all that we care about somehow is coherently connected? I thought maybe I would begin by remembering, an African man from 1,500 years ago, depending on how we see history and how we understand, the work of God in the world thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago. Most of us would assume that Augustine of Hippo was not a European. He was on the northern edge of Africa, and it's hard to know just what he might have looked like. I've seen various portraits over the years, maybe you have too. Some make him look like he could have been from Italy but others make him look like he clearly was an African. I'm assuming that he was more African than European, and I think about him in my life in the world. But Augustine of Hippo was somebody who I want to set before us today in terms of his thinking through the questions of a coherent life in the world, the challenge of coherence. I'm going to offer two big words. We won't dwell on them, but I want to set them out before you, not because they're too difficult, but they're just unusual words in some ways. But they're the words meta-narrative and narrative. Meta-narrative and narrative. And meta-narrative is the idea that there's a story that makes sense of all of life. A story that makes sense of all of life. Buddhists believe that to be true. Hindus believe that to be true. Jews do. Muslims do, Christians do, secular materialists do, hedonists do. Everyone everywhere believes in something about this is what life is all about. It's all about this, you see. This is the story that makes sense of all the stories. That's what a meta-narrative is. And a narrative, of course, is more the story of Sam Owen's life and Cosmo Katera's life and Stephen Garber's life and your life. It's the story of my life. And the question is, can there be a coherent relationship between what I think to be true of all of life and what's true of my life, of what I believe to be true of everything and what I believe to be true of me in the world? Now, Augustine of Hippo was probably clearly the person who has given us the most seminal, the most important, the most foundational thinking about this of anyone in the world. I wanted to say this to you, my African brothers that you are. It was an African who gave this contribution to the world, to history, actually. We have two great books of his that we know about over the course of centuries. One is a book called The Confessions. The other book is called The City of God. I'm not going to go into book reviews of these books today, other than in some ways simply to note them as we think about these two ideas of a story for all of life, for all of reality, for everything about who I am. Think about who we are as human beings in the world. But then, so who's Augustine of Hippo? And who is Sam Owen? And who is Stephen Garber? And who are you? And the question, of course, again, to say it quite simply, I hope very plainly, is can there be coherence between what we believe to be true about everything and what is true about me, about how I live in the world? And in these two great books that Augustine wrote, Confessions and City of God, I hope you can hear in them and see in them that the one is the first autobiography we know in the history of literature. It's written by Augustine of Hippo, an African, the first autobiographical book we know in history. And it really is from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. It's a story of his own life, almost painfully sometimes, very, very fascinating all the time, really. On the one hand, written in the 5th century in African, Mediterranean world. But it's also a book which, of course, if you know the story at all, it's a story which is remarkably like you and like me. It's a remarkably perennial story, a story about what it means to live in the world and be born into the world and to grow up into the world and take up responsibilities in the world, called The Confessions. And when I read it, I think, it could be written yesterday, actually. It could be written tomorrow, actually, because you see, it's about me, even though it's plainly and profoundly about Augustine, too. I could say a lot more about it, but I'll leave it there. The City of God is a book, really, looking at two cities, the city of God, the city of man. And the City of God is a story, it's a book about history, about the nature and meaning of history, about what's it mean to live in the world as human beings in the world. The City of God, and it's a story, hundreds and hundreds of pages, really, an analysis of these two cities. One, a city born of a love for God and a love for God's people in the world, for love for one's neighbor in the world. Contrast with a story about the city of man, which is always and everywhere a story about me and about me, about me again. Because it's a self-centered story. It's about a city focused upon, who I am in relationship to no one else but me, actually. Because you see, all of life, finally and fully, is about me. And it's a nuanced, complex book, and I hope maybe you'll find your way into it if you don't already know the book, really. It'd be a great book to read together, actually, as a group of men who are committed to Nairobi and to Kenya and to maybe beyond that, to think through what do these two cities look like, in the 21st century, in light of Augustine's own thinking, which is still profound and perennially important. Well, the question is really for all of us, for every one of us, and I hope that you can hear that. In the last several years of my life, I've been teaching at a place in Vancouver, British Columbia for these years. And I was professor of marketplace theology, the professor of the theology of the marketplace, of what work in the world's about, of what vocations in the world are all about, of thinking through questions, not only for, Vancouver, British Columbians, but actually for people from all over the place who would come into Canada, into Vancouver for studies there, wanting to understand the theology of the marketplace. One of the essays that I would give to my students was by an Irish missiologist, an Irish theologian, somebody who's studying the nature of the mission of God in the world. The fascinating focus of his study, though, was looking at the church in Rwanda over the course of the 20th century. It's fascinating, it's detailed, it's rich, it's nuanced, it's complex. But what he argues, what he's looking at in particular is what happened between the early 20th century, when Rwanda was seen by many people as sort of the crown jewel of Christian witness in Africa, maybe the most Christianized nation in Africa. And of course, the horrific genocidal moment which came before the century was over, when way too many people were massacred by Rwandans killing Rwandans. Had this genocide happened in this most Christianized nation of Africa? I won't be cheap with you, and you shouldn't be cheap about this either, of course, because it's a terribly weighty question. But I'll just, come to the very heart of his argument, which was this: that the way the gospel was taught to Rwandan people in the 20th century, he argues, was a compartmentalized gospel, We could use the language of, Achibi. It was a falling apart. It was a disconnected. It was Archbishop Abakula saying, we've taught a Jesus, but it has nothing to do with vocation. And then, of course, we have resultingly, consequentially, we have corrupt cultures because we've disconnected faith from vocation to culture. Well, I wish I could actually be with you maybe for a day or 2 or 5. We could actually read this essay together and talk it through. What do you think about it? How would you judge it? Do you think he's right about this or not? It's a fascinating essay, and I would commend it to you. But you see, what he argues as an Irishman looking at Rwanda with unusual insight and mature experience, but judging when all is said and done, seeing the very same things that Archbishop Abakula saw, a disconnection between faith and vocation and culture. Well, to say it again, dear men, friends that I assume you to be, and I wish I could work out in the days and years ahead a way to be more friends with all of you. But let me just say to you again, this is a problem not of Rwanda especially, or of Africa at large in a particular way, but it really is a problem for human beings in the world, wherever we are in the world. It's an American problem. It's an all over the world problem. Of course, it's an African problem too. And the problem is what? Well, I would put it maybe most simply like this. It's a problem of dualism. Hear the word, because it's a weighty word for us this morning, dualism. And I would argue that we as human beings, sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, have a disposition to dualism. But what do I mean by that? Well, of separating this from this, of separating belief from behavior, of separating doctrine from discipleship, of separating my worldview from my way of life. I hope that you can hear those words. A disposition to dualism. What's it look like? How does it happen? Well, one of the stories that has most come to take hold of me over the last several years has been a story which is both African, but also, American. And it's British as well. So you have these 3 different parts of the world: England, America, and Africa. It's a story about a very famous man for most of us, a well-known man, a man we're all grateful for in our own different ways. His name was John Newton. We best know him, of course, because he wrote that wonderfully rich and important hymn called Amazing Grace. But John Newton was an Englishman who ran off to sea as a teenage boy, ends up in Africa along the way. Over the course of the next years of his life, he has this experience and does this and learns about this, and finally becomes a slave ship captain, taking Africans across the Middle Passage, as it was called, into the Americas and selling them for slaves. Who was behind all this? It was England, actually, the British Empire, because the slave trade was the economic engine of the British Empire for most of its years, really. You couldn't have slaves on English soil, ironically, but you could sell slaves to the rest of the world and make a fortune, which, of course, was the economic engine of the British Empire. And John Newton, Englishman that he was a captain of ships taking slaves to the Americas. He did that for quite a few years of his life. And of course, the story we know, if we've paid attention at all, is that one day, surprise or surprise, he opens up some shipmate's, wooden box and finds in it a Bible. And somehow in the amazing providences of God, the great mercies of God, the great amazing mercies of God, he opens the Bible, begins to read, and somehow in the Holy Spirit's own work in Newton's life, he was confronted with the holiness of God and his own sin, and he made a repentant confession of sin. And we love the story to be that after that day, everything changed for John Newton, really. He finished that slave ship, travel back to England, began to become a serious Christian, wrote Amazing Grace, and met William Wilberforce, and what a great story it is. But you see, that's not the story that actually is the story, because Newton kept being a slave trade captain for years after that repentant moment. He ironically and terribly would have Bible studies with other officers of the ship on the top deck of the ships, while the holds were still full of slaves, seeing no relationship between his confession of faith and his life in the world. In Archbishop Wabakula's, assessment, a disconnection between faith and vocation and culture. Well, eventually he did leave the slave trade world and did settle into England and did become an Anglican clergyman or a clergyman along the way, and did write Amazing Grace. But it took about 30 some years from what we can best read in terms of his life for him to finally say out loud, I was a part of a terrible, terrible, terrible work, the work of the slave trade. And I'm deeply, deeply sorry for that. We don't know his heart of hearts. We read his letters. We can read things about him. But you see, what I'm saying to you is we have a disposition to dualism, of disconnecting faith from vocation to culture, of belief from behavior, of what I say I believe to be true about God and the world from how I actually live in the world. And that's a problem, my brothers. It's a problem, actually. It's a great problem. I'm going to give Augustine, actually, the last word again. It's a good word for us to, to leave with today as we begin our morning together. If we know the books, the Confessions and the City of God, a lesser known book, but actually a book probably more widely published and printed than any other book he did for 1,500 years. It's a book called the Enchiridion, the Enchiridion. It's a Latin word for the handbook, the handbook. And the story behind it is that a man of the world in Rome, imagine somebody there today with you from Nairobi, but somebody whose life was in the world. He's beginning to watch the falling apart of the Roman Empire. He had no categories to make sense of this called the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. He simply was a Roman living in the 5th century, beginning to see in some ways, like Achebe, argued he was watching in Africa and in Nigeria in particular, things falling apart. Things falling apart. And he began to wonder, what is this? And what do we mean? What does this mean? And where do we go with this? And how do we respond to this? He was a serious, honest Christian man. And he wrote to, at that point, Bishop Augustine, who moved from being a professor to now being a clergyman, a pastor, and then a bishop. He said to Bishop Augustine, so what do Christians believe about moments of history like this? How do we respond to this at our time in the world? Augustine wrote him a long letter in response. Of course, it was nothing more than that. How could it have been that in the 5th century? But he wrote him a letter, and he outlines three major points. He says Christians believe in the Lord's Prayer, and then he kind of teases this out. We believe in this and this and this, walking through the Lord's Prayer with this man named Laurentius. Then he said, well, we also believe in the Apostles' Creed. And he outlines the creed, idea by idea, belief by belief, doctrine by doctrine. And he says to him, but Laurentius, I want you to understand that we believe in the theological virtues of faith and hope and love. And then, of course, he teases those out in the letter. Faith means this. I believe this to be true. Hope means this. I look forward to the future for this, really. But he says love means this. And when he says love means this, he says facet in a way which, when I first read these words years ago, I thought, oh my, that goes to my deepest heart, doesn't it, actually? Because what he argues is that it is the question, what do you love? Which is the most important of all the questions we could ask anyone. What do you love? What do you love? Because what he argues is that I could ask the question, what do you believe? And you can say all kinds of things, even the most orthodox confession of faith. I believe this. As Archbishop Wabakula said, we teach Jesus all over Kenya, all over Africa. Millions have come to faith, really. But it's a Jesus has nothing to say about the way I live my life, really. We've disconnected faith from vocation to culture. And Augustine said this 1,500 years ago. You could ask the question, what do you believe? And I could say all kinds of things to you, which might satisfy you. But you wouldn't really know who I am until you pushed your way into the harder, deeper, more probing question. What do you love? What do you love? Because he says it's that question which goes into the very heart of our heart, into the heart of who we are as human beings, as men in the world, as people who want to love God in the world. What do you love? What do you care most about? Augustine was called, for good reasons, the apostle of longing, the apostle of longing, because he understood that it's in our longings that we're most fully known. What do you really care most about? Because, of course, the question and the answer shapes everything else about us. Everything about us that really matters comes out of, in fact, the question, the way we answer the question, what do you love? What do you care most about? What is it that shapes you, that forms you, that animates you, that motivates you? Because you see, it's out of our loves that we are most deeply motivated. If one of Augustine's great gifts, was these books we know about, threaded through everything he wrote about, though, was a deeper insight. And I want to set this before you before we finish today. But he argued for the ordering of loves, and saw that, in fact, that it's how we order our loves that's most important. When we say the ordering of loves, pretty quickly we begin to wonder about the disordering or the misordering of our loves too. And, what is your life about, my life about? All day long, it's a life about the right or the wrong ordering of my loves, of getting my loves in the right order, in the right way, the right time, or of beginning to realize, in fact, that in the hours of my life and the days of my life, I really bungled things. I've bungled things. I've made a mess because, you see, I've misordered the loves that ought to shape who I am. I've made the love of ambition most important, the love of money most important, the love of power most important, the love of sex most important. We could walk our way through all those with much more detail, and we won't do that right now, but maybe you can in your conversations today. What does a misordered love look like? A misordered life look like? What's the disordering of my loves mean for me? And what would it take for me to actually be much more serious about the right ordering of my loves, getting the loves ordered in the right way, the right time, the right day, the right year, the right life? Let me just ask you this question, really, though, at the very end of our time today. What do you love? What is it that you love? What is it that you love? And can you see, my brothers, that in fact that question is the deepest of the questions? It's the most important of the questions. Because you see, the way we answer that question is going to shape everything about us as human beings in the world, as men in the world, as Americans, Englishmen, as Africans, as Kenyans. It's really quite a universal question. It's a perennial question. It's a question that runs its way across the centuries through the cultures and civilizations. What do you love? What's most important to you? And you see, if we fail to understand that it's coherence we're looking for in life, a coherence between what I say I love, what's most important to me, and how I live my life, Well, we're missing the point, actually. We're missing that, in fact, what life ought to look like and be like for us. It's why the Archbishop, said to me years ago over the little lunch here in a cafe in Washington, D.C., yes, Steve, I see this, but you see, we've disconnected these here. And I said back to him, well, you have in Kenya and in Africa, but my friend, we've disconnected those in America as well. So the English, so have the French, so have the Chinese, and so have the Australians, and so have the South Africans, and so have the Brazilians, and so have the Mexicans, and so have the, so have the, and so have the, and so have the. Because you see, the disposition to dualism is a problem for all of us. And I would just say before you, as we start on into our day together, it's the challenge of coherence that's before us today. It's a challenge of coherence that's before us in this life. Can there be an honest coherence between what I say I care about most of all and how I actually live my life? Coherence between what I say, this is my faith, these are my beliefs, and actually then the way that I live in the world. My beliefs shaping my life in the world, my work in the world, my faith shaping my vocation, shaping, in fact, the culture in which I live. Well, my brothers, we could say a lot more about all that than we have time for today. Hope it's a good beginning, and I'll come back to be with you again in a few hours. So may God bless you and keep you, and we'll talk some more.